Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast, brought to you by the new architecture. Not to be confused with the old new architecture, which is now old. But the new architecture, which we refer to as architecture, is new. Try it today. It's double plus good. Episode 346, Shopify's transition to the new architecture.
Welcome back, React Native Radio fans. I'm here alone today, but I have two very cool guests with me here. We're going to talk about some cool stuff that Shopify is doing right now in React Native. I'm Mazen. This is React Native Radio. Mustafa Ali, welcome to the show. I think for our guests, RNR 319, Shopify goes full throttle on React Native. Your voice might sound familiar to some of our guests from that. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mustafa Ali. I'm a director of engineering and co-head of mobile at Shopify. I lead engineering for our main app, Shopify Mobile, and also responsible for mobile foundations, tooling, and AppSec for all mobile apps at Shopify.
And also on this episode with us, we have Thiago Magalhães. I don't think I got that last name right, but I tried. Sorry. Welcome to the show, Thiago.
Thank you. So my name is Thiago Magalhães. I come from Brazil, as you can maybe tell from my name. I'm based in Montreal, worked for Shopify for the past 3 years. I'm a staff developer at the Shopify mobile app, same app as Mustafa mentioned.
Awesome. Yeah. Welcome. Thanks for coming on to the show. Before we get into our topic, let's hear from our sponsor. Infinite Red is a premier React Native consultancy located fully remote in the US. We're a team of 30 senior plus level React Native developers and support staff and have been doing this for nearly a decade. If you're looking for React Native expertise for your next project, hit us up at infinite.red/radio. Don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. Okay, let's get into our topic. Topic is Shopify's transition to the architecture with Mustafa and Thiago. Notice how I dropped a word from that title, right? I think everyone's like, oh, what architecture? The new architecture? It's no longer the new architecture. I'm trying to get that to stick. It's no longer new architecture. It's the architecture or the legacy architecture. So I guess let's kind of start off big picture. Let's, set the stage. To kick things off for us, what motivated Shopify to invest in the new architecture, or what we're calling the architecture? What problems were you seeing in the old setup that, prompted this migration?
Sure. So as you may have heard, Shopify decided to go all in on React Native back in 2020. And since then, we've migrated all of our apps to React Native. And one of the main principles for us from the start was that we did not want to just consume React Native as a technology. We also wanted to contribute back and also help push it forward. The new architecture is a major step in the evolution of React Native. So the question for us was not whether or not we should adopt the architecture, but when we should do it. So we were tracking the development closely, and we tested it several times after it came out. And we decided to hold off until earlier this year when we thought it was close to being ready for our apps, and then we decided to start migrating. And we finished it recently, as we shared not too long ago.
Yeah, and you're talking about the article that I believe Thiago was the author of, which we'll link in the show notes. And this conversation is kind of loosely based off of that article that I had read prior to this show. So were you actually seeing any, I'm going to say, problems or issues with the old architecture, or was this just more of kind of adopting the new and kind of continuing to push forward with with the React Native ecosystem?
It was mostly the latter. So when we migrated all our apps to React Native, we solved a whole bunch of challenges along the way, and then we got to a stage where we're very happy with our apps. This was mostly an initiative to stay current with what's happening in the React Native ecosystem and also help land the new architecture at our scale, because a bunch of issues that we encountered that we can get into in some time. We noticed that after releasing the new architecture and when our users started using the app. So we also wanted to surface those problems that other app devs may not have run into, and then help fix them so that everybody benefits from it.
Yeah. And like you said, we'll get to those issues that you experienced a little bit later. As you were scoping out this initiative that you mentioned, did you have some like non-negotiable goals that you kind of set in place to kind of help direct your vision to landing this new architecture?
Yeah, there are a few. So the main one for us that we did not want to drop everything else and then do this migration. We had a full roadmap of features to ship, and we don't want to delay any of that. We wanted to migrate this alongside building and shipping new features for our users. So that was a key principle for us from the start. The other one was that we wanted to make this change mostly transparent to our users. This is a big change under the hood and required a lot of work. But for actual end users, we wanted it to be a no-op of sorts. Like the app would just continue working as it was before, ideally better than what it was before. Yeah. That was our goal. So we wanted the whole approach to this migration was around these two principles: that how do we keep shipping new features while we migrate, and also how do we make sure that performance, stability, and developer experience remains the same or gets better, but doesn't regress.
Awesome. And, to our listeners, spoiler, Mustafa's here talking to us about it at this stage. It was successful, and sure, all those were accomplished along the ways. And that's also like a testament to how far the React Native team, not just the team at Meta, but the whole ecosystem, including yourselves at Shopify, have come in making sure that this is ready for, ready for the big stage. And, at your scale, it kind of proves that, any scale, whether it's enterprise or even just, small mom and pop shop, can kind of do this. Awesome. So you've made the decision, and you talked about what your non-negotiables were. Now let's talk about how you actually did pull this off, and something that you kind of went through. So I assume you were supporting both old and new architecture side by side, and that that sounds very complex. How were you able to make the two kind of coexist within each other? Because it's two completely different engines underneath the hood.
So yeah, I can take this one. So as you know, there's Flashlist, right? It's a library that was developed by Shopify, and it powers pretty much, throw a number, 90% of our app is Flashlist pretty much. So it's a pretty simple goal. If you bring Flashlist to the new architecture, then you have the majority of your app working with the new architecture. So that was one of the pillars that we needed to tackle first. As for like conditional code between the app, what works on the new architecture, what works on the old architecture, in reality, there is not that much. I think there's a lot of mystery about what the new architecture is going to break or not break in your app. And turns out it's not that complicated. Meta did a pretty good job of creating interop layers for old native modules, as I like to call them today, instead of turbo modules. So there is a pretty good backwards compatibility. But Flashlist was the main focus of that, because the majority of the changes of the new architecture, at least from my perspective, is the layout, fabric itself, right? The layout mechanism. So that would have pretty big consequences to the way Flashlist was developed before, which was totally on the old architecture. So it's mainly working on Flashlist, bringing it up to speed with the new architecture, patching parts of our code so that pieces of it that would not work with the new architecture were either we just put a conditional code to block it from executing while we're developing, so that we can have an app that functions on both architectures, although not optimally on the new one. And we go from there doing incremental bug fixes and shipping things to main without disrupting the day-to-day development. And one of the other, we're probably going to talk about this because it's in the article, but Top Hat was a huge part of this, right? So for those who don't know, Top Hat is it's not a testing tool, but it's pretty much like the blood that runs into how we do things in mobile with Shopify. So as a developer in Shopify, when you're developing new features, you create a pull request, and then you have this bot that will comment out on your pull request with links to the iOS app and the Android app based on the PR that you just submitted. And people can just one-click install that on their simulators or devices or whatever, and test it right away without having to check out your branch and build and all of those things to slow us down, right? So we leveraged Top Hat for that. And the way we did this is basically made Top Hat emit, instead of one build for Android and one build for iOS, it emits two builds, one on the new architecture, one on the old architecture for both platforms. So mostly people who are working on the new architecture could just go into any random pull request that we wanted to test and just grab that version and see how is that working on the new architecture, right? So that's how we maintain it at a, it's a broad overview of how we maintain it. And
and that's very complex, right? Because two ecosystems, and I kind of want to mention to our listeners, Top Hat, if you're in the Expo ecosystem, it's probably Expo Orbit is the equivalent. Now, Expo Orbit, you can't necessarily do custom builds, right? And I think you all can tell me where the differences lie between the two. I'm sure there's some differences. Is Top Hat available open source for anyone to use?
Yeah, it's open source, and actually, fun fact, Orbit was inspired by Top Hat.
Well, there you go. Yeah. In this article, you mentioned how you kept up to date with React Native core updates because, maybe you realized some issues may have been fixed upstream or whatnot. As consultants, this is something that we usually have these conversations with our client all the time. And we tend to see teams missing the point, of why to stay up to date, right? It's almost like, why am I going to update to the latest version? There's going to be some breaking change and I'm going to have to do regression testing. And then, it kind of snowballs from there, essentially. Is there anything else? Is there anything you all want to stress about that point to any of our listeners that are kind of looking at it from that perspective? Why always update?
Many of the big bug fixes go into the next version of React Native usually, and sometimes they get backported to older versions. So if you are encountering an issue, unless that bug fix has been backported, you don't have too many options apart from migrating to the new version of React Native. Now, understand that there's a certain level of investment that's involved in it, but think of it this way, when you have third-party dependencies in your app, when a new version comes out, it has some bug fixes and performance improvements and new features. It's usually not a big deal to upgrade to that new version. But when it's the main framework itself, people are sometimes hesitant, and that's understandable. But there's a trade-off here. Do you want to spend time trying to find workarounds for bugs that have already been fixed in a new version? Or do you just want to move to a new version and not deal with those issues anymore? So I think it's not a yes or no answer. It's a set of trade-offs that you have to make. One thing that helps is talking to other teams who are also using React Native, and they usually we get to hear from other folks who have encountered similar issues before, and they can confirm that yes, this has been resolved for them. So we have higher confidence that the investment we have to make to move to the next version is worthwhile.
Yes, and adding to this, a very good point. During the development during the migration to the new architecture, there were many, many problems that we encountered that we frankly spent weeks trying to figure out what was happening, from clicking on certain buttons not resulting in any actions, and why is that not happening, and start debugging the internals of React Native to try to find out what happened. Turns out this was already fixed on the version that was up for a couple of months, and we were just behind, right? So that's one of the things that if I could go back in time and redo this project, I would probably ensure that wasn't the latest React Native version before I even started analyzing what was breaking and what was not, right? And in some cases, we found fixes and before we migrated to the new version, to upgrade it to a new version of React Native. And then we had to undo those because it turns out they were fixed upstream in a much better way, right? So I think, especially when you're dealing with React Native, which is probably the biggest dependency on a React Native project, obviously, I think you should try to stay current with it as much as possible.
Okay, so you're saying adopt the latest version of React Native over 20 patch packages. Makes sense. I could get behind that. All right, so let's kind of dig in a little bit into some of the issues that you may have run into during the migration itself and how you may have solved them, lessons you may have learned from there. I want to kind of highlight one specifically, and you all can kind of share other examples. From the article, you mentioned one of the trickiest issues was around batch state updates, breaking time-sensitive logic. We talk about how many set states can I put on my click event, which one fires first, which one, how does that happen, and how does that affect my app? Can you share that, how you solved that specific example, and potentially any other examples you want to kind of get into that would be helpful to our listeners?
Sure. So as you may imagine, Shopify mobile is a pretty big app, and there is many dependencies involved in this. And so we didn't see this issue spread out throughout the app. There were very particular situations where this was happening. I can recall one, which we still have a couple of native components that we build in the app for specific user interactions that we want, right? And those were being managed by view managers on the old architecture. So there's kind of a disconnect between the React Native fabric tree, if I may call it this way, and the native view tree. And this component was essentially a sheet that would pop from below, and you would click on a button and it would navigate to another component. And we realized at some point that this action wasn't quite working. In some cases, it never navigated. In some cases, it just navigated to the same previous component we showed and then navigated to the other one. It's like a very weird interpolation of states. So one thing we looked at was we started to debug this, and we started to notice that component had an intermediate state, that it was designed around an intermediate state, which would trigger a side effect, which would be this navigation, right? And we realized that this intermediate state wasn't showing up on the logs, pretty much. So we quickly realized that this is probably an optimization that React Native is doing, and rightfully so, because that intermediate state was maybe not the best way to codify how you want this component to behave, right? So the fix was mostly, let's rethink the state management of this screen, right? Let's create a bit more deterministic states. Let's wait for certain operations to happen before we move to the next state. So when we're a bit more intentional about the state management of that component, React Native is able to optimize it without breaking it, if that makes sense. So this is one of the examples I found. I don't think this is a widespread issue where state bashing is going to break your components per se, but assumptions have changed on the new architecture as to how the state management will behave. And I guess it's more of a recommendation. If you start seeing weird behavior like that, looking at the state management is probably a good idea to try to understand if you're being affected by the state bashing, because maybe you didn't do state put in quotes, like the correct way, or in a way that only worked on the old architecture. We've been all guilty of this as part of development.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the new architecture was initially announced and it was like, oh, we're going to adopt, I can't remember what specific version of React it was. The benefit of this is you can do 2 to 3 set states right next to each other and only one re-render will trigger, right? It was true in some cases, right? And that was the objective at the end of the day. And I think now we're probably closer to that. But back then I remember seeing variable results from it and kind of seeing on Discord that, that wasn't necessarily the case there. So awesome. Now, one thing that I think a lot of our listeners might benefit from, and I think I would be interested in also hearing about, is how did you all benchmark, tricky things like time to interaction? Because that I think is a very important aspect of an app, that user experience, because you don't want a user to know you're building your app in JavaScript, right? At the end of the day, they want that native feel. So did you benchmark your TTI and make sure you weren't regressing? Did you use any specific tools?
Yeah, we've invested quite a lot in this area over the years. That was the main thing. One of the main things we focused on when we switched from Kotlin and Swift to React Native. So we have performance markers for all the screens in the app. And we emit them to an observability tool where we track how our app is performing in production. When it comes to this migration, there are a bunch of things that we did before release and after release. So before we ship this, we have an automated end-to-end test suite that runs the app and collects TTI numbers, and then we can compare that to the baseline. So what we did was we had baselines for the legacy architecture. We ran the suite. We compared that with the numbers on the new architecture and see where the deltas were. In some cases, it was faster. Some cases, it was slower. So then for those cases, we investigated what was going on and implemented optimizations. Now, that we do for every release, essentially. So we ship on a weekly basis. So regardless of old or new architecture, we just do that. So that helped quite a lot. After release, like I mentioned, we collect a ton of performance data, and then we look at trends essentially, and then try to figure out what is actually happening in production. And then we have alerts associated with these. So if we have internal targets for what the TTI should be, and then if it exceeds that TTI across our user base, then an alert gets fired. People are on call, investigate, release a fix, and we go from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I kind of want to mention bring out this stat that you all have in your article. App launch times improved by about 10% on Android and 3% on iOS. 3% might seem very small, right? But in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty big. And again, as a developer that's kind of worked on these type of migrations, that 3% does not directly correlate to the amount of work that went into that 3%, right? It's a lot. That 3% of time that was improved, but probably 120% of your actual time to get there and energy. So yeah, I get that. So congrats on that. I think that's pretty cool that your numbers are all, much better from where there was before. And kind of one thing I want to touch on earlier that you all mentioned was FlashList V2. Shout out to Talha Nakvi for that work. I know it's something that we've used in our Ignite boilerplate app, and we've seen a lot of, performance improvements from that, and today there's a lot of different packages out there to use. So a lot to choose from. Cool. So kind of done a little bit of a technical deep dive. Let's talk about the future impact that you all have. So now that you're fully on the new architecture, does this unblock you to build features that you weren't able to in the past?
Oh, it doesn't necessarily unblock us for building it. I think React Native is very capable on both architectures for building pretty much anything. But it does allow us to explore more interesting developer experience or even user experience in terms of performance gains that we might have. I think the biggest thing, in my opinion, is the synchronous layout. And so before, you have this situation where you have to wait for something to be laid out so you can get layout numbers and then you can resize something. So the layout cycle becomes this jello almost, where your UI is adapting to what's happening little by little, right? And the new architecture, and that's what we could see with FlashList too, is that you can get all of these values in one shot. For instance, FlashList eliminated estimated sizes just by leveraging the synchronous layout capabilities of Fabric, right? Mm-hmm. So that will certainly allow us to build more interesting user experiences. Pretty excited to see what kind of animation work we can do with that. And from a developer perspective, Turbo modules, they eliminate a lot of asynchronous code that you would otherwise have in your app. So that makes components much easier to deal with, in my opinion. You don't have to create hooks to abstract async operations. You can just straight up just call the native module and get the value you want, right? So personally and selfishly, I'm pretty excited by that part. But
that's a big one,
yeah.
Right? That eliminates the wait time to go back, async, await. You never necessarily know what's going to happen. With the bridge, the UI thread, the JS one thread is probably locked up, right? Let's be honest here.
Yeah.
But with the ability now with Fabric and the ability to just kind of go in, get your value, come back, absolutely great developer experience there. I totally agree with you. So I think, Mustafa, you mentioned that you had a tool where you were looking at and comparing the deltas between old architecture and new architecture and making sure you have that. So now that you're fully on the new architecture, I'm assuming you're still tracking those stats and making sure those deltas stay steady or continue to improve, right? And do you have any other systems in place to catch regressions, whether it's visual also?
Yeah, so we track performance numbers on an ongoing basis. Performance work is never done because you can improve, you can have a performance issue in your app, you can improve, you can fix it, but then at the same time, you're also shipping a bunch of new features, and changes have this annoying habit of also very randomly, when you least expect it, bring down performance of your app. So it has to be something you have to do on an ongoing basis. Apart from that, we do a bunch of other things. Screenshot testing is a big one. So we have a very comprehensive screenshot test suite that we run for our app. We have the Shopify mobile app is pretty massive, hundreds of screens, and you can manually go and check if anything is broken in each of those screens. It's just not humanly possible at this point. So we have an internal library that we build that basically generates screenshots on the fly and then compares them with the baseline. And if something has changed in a way that we don't want to, it flags us so that we can fix it quickly. So that saves us a ton of time.
Nice. Cool. So here's a question I think I'd like each of you to help answer for us. If another company, so Mustafa, if another developer, Thiago, is looking at doing this migration, what should they watch out for?
Yeah, I have a few recommendations myself. And a bit of a fun story I mentioned that the blank screen of doom in the article, which first time I ran the app into the new architecture, you switch the flags and you build it. Then we get a blank screen. There's absolutely no logs, no anything. So
isn't that fun?
Except that this will probably happen. So it's fine. What I would say is that in 90% of our cases, this was due to a native module that was doing something that the new architecture wasn't happy about. So I think it's like try to find the culprits on your code for these issues. I would say native modules, that's something you need to scrutinize. I think you need to add logging, a very thorough logging for before you start the migration for the new architecture, so you know exactly what's happening in your app during development, so that you can quickly find what's blocking the rest of the app from rendering. That's the first thing I would say. The other thing which I mentioned on another talking point was the state batching aspect of it, right? If you know that there is a component that you have a tech debt that you never paid, you should probably pay that tech debt now, or put that into consideration as you migrate. There's a very high chance that it will bite you later, because if you're hacking state in a way that worked on the previous architecture, and if there's the piece of code that you think is questionable and you know it's questionable, but you left it there because it's working anyway, it is probably going to stop working. And it's another point of investigation that you want to do. I think, again, performance is paramount. You should be profiling your performance and keeping track of regressions. Even if you're not going to do anything about it, just capture those numbers. Keep those numbers handy. Have a history of like, was my app faster or slower in this period of time? It's extremely important, especially with like a large change like the new architecture. I think those would be my top 3 recommendations.
Yeah. Mustafa.
The main thing I would recommend is don't wait too long to start. Meta has already announced that they're going to drop support for legacy architecture in the next major release. So I think time to migrate to the new architecture is now. The longer you delay it, the more painful it will get. The other thing I would say is test as much as possible internally, but also be prepared to encounter unexpected issues when you start rolling out. We did a lot of testing internally, but then some crashes we only found when we actually started shipping to production. So we've covered this in the article as well, but we were very deliberate about how we rolled out this change to our user base. So we started very slow, monitored things very closely. As we found unexpected issues, we started fixing them, and then rolled it out more broadly to our user base. So be prepared for that. And as long as you have good monitoring in place, you can catch those things, ship fixes, and then move forward with the rollout.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. I think I hope no one is starting their migration journey, right? There's a lot that goes into that journey. First is just even having that conversation. I hope no one is at that stage at this point, because like you said, Meta has announced it a lot, and at the time of this recording, RC5 for version 82 was released. I believe it was released this morning. And I love the note that it has, and I'm going to read it out loud. Crash the app if they force the legacy architecture. So there you go. I mean, if Meta is not sending you a big enough sign at this point, yeah. And like we mentioned earlier, right? Try and stay on the latest version, because that latest version probably has a solution that you're looking for your bug. So new architecture is the solution. And I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. If you find a package that you're running into issues that's not new architecture compatible, which I believe is very rare these days, I haven't heard of any at this point. But if you do find an outlier, please reach out, and we'll raise it up with Meta, Shopify, whoever the maintainer is, and and Expo has been doing a lot too in that field and helping there. So awesome. I kind of want to ask 2 more here. If you could start this migration journey again, knowing what you know, would you do anything differently?
Without going back in time and cheating, like knowing exactly what line of code I need to fix, I would say the logging part, like adding logs everywhere. Another thing that I would probably do is increase our end-to-end testing coverage. So one of the guardrails we have in our app is we have a pretty thorough end-to-end test coverage, which will test features like from the app almost as a whole. But there's like small edge cases that are not really captured in these tests. Well, they're expensive tests. They're hard to maintain. You don't necessarily need to cover everything in these tests, but we could have covered that situation where that component where I mentioned where you click on it and the action is not happening. We could have built an end-to-end test for that ahead of time, and we would have a pretty big list of bugs before we even started to find those, right? So I think that would be good. It would not eliminate the problems we saw when you release, because especially at scale, like there will be a few crashes here and there that you need to tweak.
One thing I always tell my clients here is if a ticket is coming in as a bug, make sure we, as the developers on the app, the app is in production. It's in the store being used by users right now. If a bug ticket comes in, we're going to make sure that either a unit test, depending on what type of bug, a unit test or an end-to-end test is being put in place so that this bug doesn't rear its head again, that we save ourselves down the line. If for some reason we find an issue with React Native screens, so with new architecture down the line, we're able to capture it early so we can kind of mitigate it as soon as we kind of go that way. All right. So I think I want to ask a final question here before we sign off. What excites you the most about the future of React Native now that you're on this new architecture?
It feels like a new chapter in the story of React Native. We've been talking about the new architecture for a long time. Mm-hmm. So we're very happy to just move to the other side, get the migration done successfully. We're pretty happy with how it went. And we can now start leveraging all the new features in React Native that Meta is shipping. Also, I'm very excited personally about everything that's happening in the React Native community. Literally every single day, there are new libraries that unlock new capabilities in React Native. I'm constantly blown away by the experiences that people are building with libraries like React Native Skia. It's really good to see. Yeah. I think a few of them also got nominated for the App Store Design Award and the Google Play Award. I was very happy to see that. Yeah. So the future is bright. We are very happy with where things are going. And we want to continue contributing back and helping others build great apps as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, great call out there. And again, thank you, Mustafa, Thiago, and everyone really at Shopify for what you all are doing for the React Native community.